Hi there, it's Clyde. I'm really glad you're here with me tonight. Before we settle in for this very uneventful little adventure, I should mention I've collected all of my boring travels in one place for you. There's a whole playlist full of slow, sleepy wanderings through history. Absolutely nothing exciting happens in them, perfect for drifting off. So before your eyes get heavy, go ahead and tap the like button. And subscribe too, so you don't forget later. And if you ever want your own personalized sleepy story from me, you can become a channel member and I'll make one just for you. It helps support the channel, and I really love telling them. All right, let's begin. I always seem to arrive in places at the most in-between times. That little pocket of the evening where the sun has stopped arguing with the horizon and simply gives up, melting into a long ribbon of warm gold. That's exactly where I stepped into this moment. A quiet Pueblo village. Clay walls humming with leftover heat and a small fire crackling like it had something important to say but didn't feel like talking loudly. I found myself standing just a little off to the side of the fire, close enough to feel the cozy warmth but far enough that the smoke wouldn't try to introduce itself to my eyes. Smoke is friendly like that, always wanting to shake hands with your face. A woman sat at a large loom beside the fire, weaving a blanket with long, slow movements. Each pass of the shuttle had a rhythm to it, a soft thip, thip, thip that almost matched the crackle of the firewood. Somehow those two sounds together made my eyelids feel a little heavier than usual. It's hard to explain how weaving and fire can team up to lull a person, but they're surprisingly effective collaborators. The air smelled like juniper wood burning, sweet and earthy, mixed with something warm and comforting drifting from one of the adobe homes. Some kind of stew, maybe. Or bread. Every era seems to have at least one smell guaranteed to make a traveler suddenly very aware of how long it's been since his last meal. The woman at the loom didn't look up at first. Weaving is a kind of conversation with the wool, I suppose, and she seemed to be listening closely. This region, the ancestral homelands of the Pueblo peoples, has been a center of textile tradition for centuries. Cotton was used here long before wool arrived, and once sheep were introduced, weaving became even more elaborate. I don't know if she was thinking about any of that. She might have been thinking about dinner, or clouds, or why the neighbor's dog always chose her doorstep to nap on. I tend to assume everyone else has more profound thoughts than I do, but then again, I once spent an entire afternoon debating whether or not my cloak makes a good emergency pillow. Incidentally, it does. A little boy walked by carrying a gourd filled with water. He didn't say anything, just glanced at me with that expression children often have when they see a stranger. Curiosity, mild confusion, and the silent question of, "Are you supposed to be here?" I gave him a small smile, and he nodded politely before continuing toward one of the homes. The beads on his shirt jingled softly with each step, like a tiny percussion section following him around. Somewhere behind me, a pot rattled faintly as someone stirred it. A dog, a thin, sandy-colored one, wandered over, sniffed at my boots, decided I didn't smell interesting enough, and wandered back toward the fire. Fair enough, I've never claimed to have fascinating boots. I noticed a weaving comb lying beside the woman, a beautiful wooden tool carved with geometric patterns. The design reminded me of a dream I had once where I spent 10 minutes trying to remember the word triangle. I woke up feeling unreasonably frustrated. The woman finally glanced up, gave me a small acknowledging nod, then returned to her weaving. The fire popped loudly right then, almost as if trying to get her attention too. It's funny how a place with so many quiet sounds can still feel full of life. I sat down in an overturned clay pot. Someone must have set it there earlier, and watched the threads move under her hands. The repetition, the softness, the warmth of the fire, everything seemed designed to make a person relax. And I thought, just for a moment, that it might be nice to close my eyes. Not yet, though. There was still the whole rest of this sleepy evening ahead, and I could already feel my mind starting to wander pleasantly, like a leaf circling in slow, lazy currents of air. The first thing I noticed at the beginning of the next stretch of evening was the sound of the loom changing, not drastically. It wasn't suddenly singing opera or anything, but the rhythm shifted slightly, enough that it felt like the blanket itself was beginning to wake up and decide what kind of story it wanted to tell. The woman weaving had added a new color, a deep, warm red. It made me think of canyon walls at sunrise, those layers of ancient stone glowing like embers. She pulled the yarn through with such calm precision that it almost made my own breathing slow down to match it. A breeze picked up, gentle enough that it only brushed the tops of the nearby sage bushes. I love sagebrush. It always smells like someone accidentally spilled a basket of peace and quiet. Even the tiny rustle of its leaves sounds sleepy, like the plants gossiping about nothing in particular. Behind us, someone in one of the homes was grinding corn, shk, 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 a soft scraping rhythm that blended perfectly with the weaving Pueblo communities have prepared corn like this for thousands of years, and the sound has accompanied countless meals and countless ordinary evenings. There's something comforting about knowing some sounds never really leave human history. They just continue, patiently, like they know we'll always need them. I shifted a little on the overturned pot I was sitting on. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it also wasn't going to win any awards for cushioning. A small lizard had climbed onto a nearby sun-warmed stone and was staring at me with that unblinking, judgmental expression lizards always seem to have. I nodded politely to it. It did not nod back. Very one-sided friendship. A young man, maybe in his late teens, walked past carrying a stack of firewood in his arms. He paused long enough to greet the woman at the loom, then gave me a quick, curious glance before continuing toward the fire pit. He added a few pieces to the flames and the crackling brightened immediately. Fire is extremely enthusiastic when you feed it. Almost overeager, really. The weaving woman began to hum softly. It wasn't a song I recognized. Very gentle, almost circular, as if the melody was weaving too. It drifted around the firelight like something made of thread and smoke. My mind began to wander again, the way it does when the world is quiet enough that thoughts start drifting around like slow butterflies. I found myself staring at the colors forming in the blanket. Red, cream, a thin stripe of dark green. I wondered who it was for. A family member, a gift, someone celebrating something. Or maybe she was making it just because her hands liked working with yarn. Some blankets are woven with clear intention. Others are woven simply because it feels good to create something warm. The little dog from earlier, the sandy-colored one, came back over and sniffed at my knee. I offered my hand. It sniffed again, decided this time I was slightly more interesting than before, and sat down next to me like we'd known each other for months. I appreciated that. Dogs are good at deciding when a person looks like they need company. A shadow passed overhead, just a bird gliding silently across the dusky sky. Probably a hawk returning to its roost. The moment felt like it had been painted into place. Firelight, weaving, quiet voices, soft ground, warm clay walls holding on to the last daylight. And me, just sitting there, doing nothing important at all. Which is exactly what I'm best at. I could feel my eyelids starting to droop again, the kind of slow heaviness that arrives without asking permission. But I wasn't quite asleep. Just floating, really letting the weaving and the breeze and the fire do all the work for me. Another quiet chapter of the evening, settling softly into place. The fire had settled into that phase where the flames weren't trying to impress anyone anymore. They just rose and fell in slow waves, like they were breathing along with the night. I shifted a little, letting my legs stretch out, and the sandy-colored dog adjusted too, leaning gently against my boot as if we'd been doing this every evening for years. The woman's loom clicked softly as she worked in another band of color. This time a deep brown, almost the shade of the adobe around us. The colors of the blanket looked like the landscape had decided to gather itself into stripes. A few sparks drifted upward, and for a moment I watched them rise like tiny lanterns before disappearing into the growing darkness. Sparks always seem so determined when they first leap up, and then immediately change their minds halfway. I can relate to that more than I'd like to admit. Behind us, someone stepped out of a doorway holding a bowl of dough. They pressed it onto a flat stone near an outdoor hearth, shaping it methodically. Pueblo bread baked in outdoor ovens has been a tradition for countless generations. A quiet, dependable ritual. I couldn't smell it yet, but I knew that once it started cooking, the entire village would smell like comfort itself. A cricket chirped nearby, then another, cautiously, like they were checking whether their timing matched the weaving rhythm. It didn't, but I appreciated the effort. Nature doesn't always aim for harmony, but it accidentally gets there sometimes. My eyes drifted down to a small pile of objects near the loom. I wasn't sure who put them there, but the assortment felt wonderfully random. A smooth river stone, a wooden spindle, a single feather, and what looked suspiciously like a dried chili pepper. It made me wonder if someone had been planning to do 3 entirely different chores, and then forgot which one came first. A feeling I know very well. In the distance, a faint drumbeat began. Not loud, just steady. It might have been someone practicing, or maybe preparing for a gathering later. Pueblo drums have a deep, heartbeat-like sound. When you hear them, your body quietly decides it doesn't need to rush anywhere. The young boy from earlier appeared again, this time carrying a bundle of herbs. He paused beside the loom and whispered something to the woman. She smiled softly at him, nodded, and he ran off again, his bare feet leaving light prints in the dust. The weaving woman paused briefly, holding the threads between her fingers. She looked up at the sky, which had shifted from gold to purple. That in-between color, the one you only get for a few minutes, washed over the adobe walls like a soft blanket of its own. I wondered, not for the first time, how many evenings like this she had lived. Hundreds, thousands. Maybe she knew every nuance the fire could make, every breeze that wandered through the sage, every bird that circled overhead at this time of night. I, on the other hand, was still trying to make peace with the fact that my cloak always slides off my left shoulder, no matter how nicely I ask it not to. But that's the nice thing about evenings like this. You don't need to be wise to sit in them. The world does all the thinking for you. The fire cracked once more, as if politely reminding everyone it was still here, still warm. And the rhythm of the loom returned, steady as ever. Another calm chapter woven into the evening. The night settled in a little deeper, the kind that doesn't rush but just slowly wraps itself around the world like a well-worn blanket. The weaving woman shifted the loom slightly, tightening one of the beams, and the dog beside me stretched his legs out with a sigh that suggested he'd had a very exhausting day of, well, sitting. A soft breeze wandered in from the direction of the foothills, carrying the faintest traces of sage, dust, and something that reminded me of roasted chili peppers. The combination made my stomach perform a small, hopeful rumble. Not loud, just enough to politely register its interest in food. Nearby, the oven-tending woman, the one shaping dough, lifted a rounded loaf and placed it gently into a clay horno. The moment she did, the warm, nutty smell of baking blue corn drifted outward, weaving into the cool air like a slow secret. I closed my eyes for half a second just to enjoy it. Bread has a universal language, and it always says the same thing. You're going to be okay. Behind the firelight, a slow drumbeat began again. The same one I heard faintly earlier, but this time a little closer, a little steadier. Thump, thump, thump. A heartbeat for the village. Pueblo drums are made with such care. Hand-stretched hides, carved wooden frames, painted designs that mean something to the maker. Every thump feels grounded, like it knows exactly where it belongs. I do not always feel that way. Sometimes I barely know where my left shoe is. My gaze drifted to the blanket again. The colors had changed subtly since the last time I looked. The dark brown stripe now framed by a row of creamy white. The pattern wasn't symmetrical, but it made perfect sense somehow, like the design came straight from the landscape rather than a sketch. Desert evenings aren't symmetrical either, but they're still beautiful. A grasshopper landed on the ground near my foot. It stared at me, flexed its legs, and then hopped away with such dramatic enthusiasm that I briefly wondered if it was performing for an invisible audience. Maybe this was a nightly show. One leap only, starring Hopper, the sand acrobat. The young boy with the herbs returned, carrying a small clay bowl now. He sat beside the other boy, the quieter one, and offered him a pinch of whatever was inside. They whispered something to each other and laughed softly, the way children do when they're sharing a joke no adult will ever fully understand. I considered asking what was so funny, but I suspected the answer would be something like, "We named the dog after a potato." And honestly, that would only raise more questions. The weaving woman stopped humming just long enough to take a sip from a small cup beside her. Whatever it was, tea or some herbal drink, the steam curled up into the air in a thin, dreamy ribbons. I watched it merge with the fire smoke, the two twisting together like they'd been old friends for centuries. Somewhere far off, an owl hooted once. Just a simple whoo that hung in the darkness like punctuation. The dog's ears perked up at the sound, then relaxed again when nothing followed. I leaned back a little, letting my hands rest behind me. The ground was cool now, the heat of the day long gone. My mind felt like it was drifting in slow circles, thoughts wandering from the weaving, to the fire, to the bread, to the drum, to the fact that I still couldn't remember where I put that extra button I swore I'd tucked into my cloak pocket. That mystery may never be solved. The loom resumed its steady rhythm. Thip, thip, thip. The fire crackled. Pop. Hiss. Pop. The drumbeat thumped. Thum, thum, thum. And I felt myself drifting along with them as if the whole evening were rocking me gently back and forth. Another peaceful chapter of doing absolutely nothing important, and doing it very well. The weaving had reached that stage where it no longer felt like a project and more like a memory being stitched into existence. The woman's hands moved with such quiet certainty that I started to wonder if the blanket already existed somewhere in her mind, and she was simply coaxing it into the real world one thread at a time. A new row of color appeared, a soft golden tan, like the first morning light touching the clay walls. She tapped the threads gently, tightening them into place with a wooden comb. Each tap sounded like the soft closing of a book. Behind me, I heard two muffled thuds. I turned slightly to see the young man from earlier stacking more firewood. He dropped one log because he was distracted by a kitten that had apparently appeared out of nowhere. The log landed on his foot, gently, but he made that silent grimace adults make when they're trying not to swear in front of children. The kitten, meanwhile, had absolutely no regrets. The dog beside me lifted his head, eyed the kitten, seemed to decide he was far too tired to negotiate territorial boundaries, and laid back down with a sigh that said, "Not my problem." The drumbeat returned from somewhere beyond the adobe walls. Thum, thum, thum. It wasn't loud, not the type of sound that demands attention, but the kind that settles around you like it already knows the rhythm of your breathing. I felt my shoulders relax a little more. Somewhere to the right, an elder sat outside her doorway, grinding something in a stone bowl. Corn, herbs, I couldn't quite see, but the soft, circular motion made a sound like sand shifting in a gentle tide. She seemed perfectly content, her movements steady and patient, like she had all the time in the world and no reason to hurry any of it. A pottery jar near the fire caught my eye. Painted with spirals and step patterns, it looked like it held stories inside of it. Maybe literally, maybe metaphorically, maybe both. Pueblo pottery often carries symbols meant to represent rain, clouds, mountains, or journeys. I always imagine pots whispering to each other at night when no humans are around, catching each other up on what they've seen. Meanwhile, a moth drifted lazily through the firelight, circling in a slow spiral. It didn't seem sure of its destination. To be fair, neither was I most of the time. The moth made a few more indecisive loops before gliding off toward a shadowed doorway. I hoped that it found something interesting there, like a friendly wall or a very wise spider. The weaving woman paused again, not for long, but long enough to stretch her fingers and adjust the yarn at her side. She glanced at me, offered a small, almost smile, then returned to her work. It was the kind of smile people give when they understand you're not here to interrupt anything, just to sit quietly with the evening. I picked up one of the nearby objects, the smooth river stone, and rolled it in my palm. It was cool, perfectly rounded, and heavy in a comforting way. I wondered how far it had traveled before ending up here. Maybe not far. Or maybe it had rolled down from some distant mountains long before any person ever touched it. Stones tend to keep their stories to themselves. A soft trill from a night bird echoed somewhere from the direction of the foothills. I couldn't see it, but the sound wrapped around the edges of the firelight like a soft ribbon. The first real sign that night had fully arrived. I caught myself staring into the flames again, watching the way the light danced over the threads on the loom. The blanket seemed to glow like it was warming the night from the inside out. And I thought, if blankets could talk, this one would probably tell stories about evenings exactly like this. Quiet ones, familiar ones. Ones with weaving and bread baking and sleepy dogs and the distant sound of drums. The kinds of stories I never seem to remember properly, even though I love them the most. And the night drifted onward. The fire had reduced itself to a slow, thoughtful flame, the kind that seemed perfectly content to take its time. It flickered softly against the adobe walls, creating dancing shadows that stretched and curled like they were trying to tell their own stories on the surface of the clay. The weaving woman added another row, a muted green this time, the shade of old desert sage after many summers. She packed the threads gently into place, and I could hear the faint tap, tap of her wooden comb. Even that tiny sound seemed to echo slightly in the quiet. The older woman grinding herbs paused long enough to glance over at the loom. She nodded once, approvingly, as if the blanket was coming together just the way she expected. Then she returned to a rhythmic grinding, a circular, steady pattern that sounded like someone turning the pages of a very old book. A cricket hopped closer to the fire and chirped once, then seemed surprised by its own volume. It went quiet after that, as though reconsidering its musical ambitions. Somewhere nearby, a pottery jar shifted just slightly with the cooling air. Or maybe a breeze nudged it. It made a soft, hollow clink against the ground, barely audible. That tiny sound reminded me of the time I accidentally packed 2 cups together in my satchel and spent an entire day puzzled about why my bag sounded like it contained a miniature ghost. The dog beside me stretched long and slow, his paws sliding forward until his whole body looked like a length of sleepy rope. He rested his head gently on my ankle. Not enough to trap me, but just enough to say, "This is where we sit now. Don't move." The 2 boys who had been whispering earlier were now sorting small stones into little piles. One pile was round ones, one was flat ones, one seemed to be just rocks we think look funny. They took this work very seriously. Every so often, they would hold up a stone to evaluate it, squinting at it like tiny philosophers. A slight shuffle behind me made me turn. The teenage boy, the one who kept bringing firewood, had now brought a bowl of dough to the woman tending the horno. She took the bowl from him, said something softly, and then shaped another loaf with deliberate, practiced hands. The smell of baking blue cornbread drifted across the courtyard in warm, gentle waves. It mixed with the fire's wood smoke and created the kind of scent that makes a person think, I could stay right here forever. A bat swooped once overhead, silent and quick, then disappeared into the darkness. The boys didn't notice. The dog didn't notice. Honestly, I barely noticed. Some evenings are so peaceful that even bat sightings feel like they're happening underwater. The weaving woman paused for a moment to stretch her fingers again. She looked at the pattern on the blanket as though she were reading it, not checking for mistakes, but recognizing something familiar in the way it was forming. Her eyes softened just a little, and for a moment, I wondered if this blanket carried a memory she hadn't spoken aloud. I leaned back, palms resting on the cool ground behind me. My gaze drifted lazily upward toward the sky. A few stars had emerged, just the brighter ones, shy at first, like they didn't want to interrupt the weaving below. There was a softness to this hour that felt almost intentional, as if the night had decided to show up quietly, politely, careful not to disturb the work being done or the stillness being enjoyed. And I could feel myself drifting along with it, loosening, settling, unhurried. Just another beautifully uneventful moment, stitched neatly into the fabric of the night. The stars began appearing one by one as the sky deepened into that rich, velvety blue you only get in places where the night is allowed to be truly dark. No lanterns, no streetlights, just the quiet hum of a living village and the steady glow of the fire. I shifted a little, settling into a more comfortable position. The ground had cooled and the warmth of the fire reached only so far, just enough to keep the night from feeling lonely. The weaving woman pulled her shuttle through another set of threads, and the new row of color surprised me. A faint, muted blue, like the evening sky right before the first star appears. I wondered if she had chosen that color because of the night, or if the night had arranged itself to match her blanket. Hard to say. Really, nature and weaving seemed to have a long-standing friendship here. In the background, the two boys continued sorting their stones. Their categories had grown more complex. Round ones, flat ones, shiny ones shaped like animals if you squint, ones that are absolutely terrible for skipping across water, and the newest one, rocks that probably have secrets. The boys argued softly about which pile a particular reddish stone belonged in. The older one insisted it was definitely hiding something, and the younger countered that it was too smooth to be shady. I admired their system. I might adopt it for organizing my life. Behind us, a faint rustling came from an open doorway. Someone stepped out, a woman carrying a clay cup. She took a sip, looked up at the sky as though checking on something, then nodded to herself and returned inside. People here seemed to have a quiet way of communicating with the night, like they understood what it needed. The dog, having completed his series of stretches and yawns, repositioned himself so that his head rested directly against my calf. His breathing slowed to that heavy, sighing rhythm that dogs get when they are absolutely certain everything is fine. I found myself tapping my fingers lightly against my knee in rhythm with the loom, thip, tap, thip, tap. There's something meditative about the way weaving unspools itself. One row at a time, each color taking its turn, each thread finding its place. It reminded me of stitching moments into memory, the kind of moments that seem small but end up defining entire evenings, or even entire chapters of a life. A man walked by carrying a woven basket filled with dried corn husks. He nodded politely to the weaver and gave me a curious glance. Not suspicious, just interested in this stranger who was content to sit by the fire like he belonged there. In most places I visit, people eventually decide I'm harmless. I think it's the cloak. It has a very non-threatening drape. The older woman grinding herbs finally stood up, stretching her back. She muttered something in a warm, teasing tone to the weaver, who replied with a soft laugh. I didn't understand their words, but laughter translates flawlessly across eras. From somewhere far behind the homes, a coyote called once, a long, echoing note that faded gently into the hills. The dog beside me raised one ear, considered whether to respond, then decided against it, very wise. The fire crackled a little louder, sending a small burst of sparks upward. They rose into the star-thick air, swirling briefly before fading out like tiny dancers exiting the stage. The weaving woman paused again to examine her work. The blanket had grown enough that I could see the full rhythm of it. Deep reds, earth browns, sage greens, soft creams, a touch of evening blue. A landscape in fabric form. Then she did something small and wonderful. She ran her fingers lightly across the rows, smoothing them. It looked like affection, like she wasn't just making a blanket. She was remembering something through it. I felt myself sinking deeper into the calm of the moment, breathing in time with the weaving, the fire, the distant drum beats, the hush of night settling fully around us. Another chapter sliding quietly into place, just like another row in the blanket. By the time the blanket reached what looked like its 7th or 8th row of the evening, the night had settled so fully that even the fire seemed to lower its voice. Its flames leaned inward, soft and steady, like they were whispering secrets only logs could understand. I could hear gentle conversation coming from one of the doorways behind us. 2 women speaking softly, their voices rising and falling like calm waves on a very small, very sleepy shore. I didn't understand the words, but the tone carried that familiar sound of end-of-day gratitude, the kind that happens after chores are finished and the world finally allows itself to unwind. The weaving woman dipped her fingers into a small bowl beside her, perhaps water, perhaps something to soften the yarn, and continued working. A new section emerged, warm clay red, the color of the earth after rain. I liked that one. It reminded me of a time I tried to make a clay pot and ended up creating something that looked like a confused mushroom. A very kind potter told me it had character, which is a polite way of saying no practical use whatsoever. A soft scuffle behind the loom caught my attention. Then, a small shape emerged. A chicken. Not a dramatic chicken, not a frantic chicken. Just a very casual, very confident little chicken who walked right up to the loom like it owned partial rights to the blanket. It stopped, pecked once at the ground, then looked at me. I nodded. It blinked. We came to an understanding. The chicken then circled the area in a slow, thoughtful loop, examining pebbles as if deciding which one would make the best conversational partner. Eventually it chose a pebble and sat beside it. The pebble did not react, but the chicken seemed satisfied anyway. The 2 boys noticed the chicken and immediately became serious. One whispered, "She only comes when it gets very dark." The other nodded solemnly as if this meant something prophetic. The chicken, meanwhile, was now sitting directly on top of its chosen pebble. The dog lifted his head, looked at the chicken, then laid his head back down as if to say, "This is above my pay grade." The older woman grinding herbs chuckled under her breath, clearly used to the bird's dramatic evening rituals. Behind us, the faint drumbeat began once more. Softer now, more distant, like it was blending with the stars themselves. Thum, thum, thum. I leaned a little closer to the fire, letting my hands warm up again. The flames cast gentle ripples of light across the pottery jars nearby, each one painted with unique swirling designs. Storms, steps, spirals, symbols that meant something far deeper to the people here than they ever could to a wandering visitor like me. The weaving woman paused her work long enough to adjust a few threads, and I noticed something warm in her eyes. The kind of look someone gives when they're creating something that holds meaning, something that belongs to more than one moment in time. She smoothed the rows again and resumed her careful weaving, letting the night gather itself around us like a second blanket. The chicken stood up, repositioned itself, and gently sat back down on the same pebble. The boys nodded, as if this confirmed several important theories they'd been developing. And I smiled, quietly, at the way even the smallest, simplest creatures can shape the rhythm of an evening. Another soft moment, another quiet piece of the night, woven into place. The night had fully arrived by now, not rushing in all at once, but settling down slowly, like a guest who knows they're welcome to take their time. The fire had grown smaller, lower, quieter. Even its crackles sounded softer, like they didn't want to disturb anyone's thoughts. The weaving woman paused once more, lifting the blanket slightly to examine how the newest rows blended together. The shifting firelight made the colors gently ripple like desert hills at dawn. The blues, reds, browns, and creams softened under her hands, each shade rich with purpose, even if I never learned what each one meant to her. I've always liked how some things don't need to be explained to be understood. The boys with the stones had now expanded their system even further. Their latest category was rocks that look like food but absolutely are not food. They took turns showing each other small stones and debating whether they looked more like beans or tiny potatoes. The chicken contributed by pecking at one rock in the not food category and immediately confirming their hypothesis. The dog shifted again, leaning his full warm weight against my leg. He let out a glowing sigh, the kind that suggests he had finally solved all of his personal problems simply by existing in a cozy spot next to a friendly human. I rested my hand gently on his back, feeling the quiet rise and fall of his breath. Somewhere above us, the stars multiplied. They seemed to arrive in clusters, as if showing up fashionably late together. The sky grew full of them, shimmering, unhurried, steady. In a village like this, far from the bright lights of the future, starlight has room to breathe. I tipped my head back to look at them, only to accidentally catch the scent of the blue cornbread drifting from the horno again. The air carried it across the courtyard in waves, warm and comforting. My stomach made another polite and hopeful comment. Honestly, I should travel with a loaf of bread. It would solve so many things. The older woman with the grinding bowl finally stood, wiping her hands on her woven apron. She murmured something affectionate toward the weaver, something that made the weaver smile softly. It was a smile that said, "I've done this a long time, but it still matters." She smoothed the blanket again, and I realized how much of her day, her stories, and her memories were woven into it. Maybe blankets hold warmth not just in temperature, but in history. A tiny gust of wind drifted past and nudged the edges of the loom. The woman steadied it with one hand, then looked toward the sky. A shooting star streaked across the darkness, faint but unmistakable. A quiet line of silver fading before the boys even had a chance to turn their heads. The woman saw it. She nodded once, acknowledging it like an old friend passing by for just a moment. The man who had been stacking wood earlier stepped out of another doorway carrying a clay cup. He sat down on a low stool, letting the fire warm his hands while he drank. He didn't speak. No one felt the need to speak. Some evenings say everything by simply being themselves. I noticed the weaving woman tie off the end of the yarn she was working with, not finishing for the night, just pausing, like placing a finger gently in a book to save the page. She let her hands rest in her lap for a moment, gazing at the growing blanket the way someone looks at a childhood home. The fire gave a soft pop. A spark rose and spiraled upward. The chicken repositioned itself on its pebble. The dog sighed again. And the night wrapped itself around us all with the patience of centuries. Another quiet, uneventful chapter, the kind that stays with you, even when everything else moves on. The weaving slowed, not stopped, just softened. The way movement does when the night has grown thick and calm enough that even the most patient hands begin to feel the weight of the hour. The fire had settled into glowing embers, quietly offering its warmth without needing to announce itself anymore. The stars above us were brighter now, sharp and steady, like tiny lanterns hung one by one across the sky. The weaving woman lifted the blanket one more time, letting it drape softly over her hands. It had grown into something beautiful, simple, yet full of meaning, as though every color had been chosen by the land itself. The stripes glowed faintly in the firelight, red like canyon walls, brown like ancient earth, cream like sunlight on clay, green like sage, blue like the very edge of night. She smoothed it once with her palms, not fussing, but appreciating. A small, peaceful acknowledgement that the evening's work had become something real. The older woman with the grinding bowl let out a tiny sigh as she finally set her tools aside, stretching her back with a satisfied little groan. She glanced toward the blanket, nodded once, and whispered something warm and approving. Even I didn't need to understand the words to know the feeling behind them. The boys with the stones had arranged their final categories for the night. Rocks shaped like food, but not food. Rocks that probably had secrets. Rocks that looked like lizards if you tilted your head. Rocks that the chicken had pecked and were therefore special. The chicken sat proudly on her pebble, as if supervising the completion of the blanket. She gave one gentle cluck of approval. The boys clucked back at her, very seriously. Negotiations seemed to go well. The dog beside me curled himself into a perfect sleepy spiral, nose tucked under his tail, entirely convinced that the world was a safe and comfortable place. I rested a hand on his back, feeling the slow, steady rise and fall of his breaths. It was the kind of calm that sinks straight into your own bones. A few embers rose from the fire and drifted upward like tiny sparks of memory. One floated higher than the rest, glowing orange against the dark sky before disappearing. It reminded me of how moments work. Bright for an instant, then settling quietly into the story of a place. The weaving woman finally stood, stretching her fingers with a tired but content smile. She folded the blanket gently, pressing it to her chest for a moment I didn't ask who it was for. Some things feel sacred simply by existing, and questions only distract from their softness. The night had grown cool, brushing against my cloak and cheeks. Someone closed a wooden door softly in the distance. Another woman banked her fire. A baby somewhere gave a single sleepy fuss before settling again. The village was ready to rest. I felt the familiar sensation beginning in my palm, a soft warmth as if a gentle hum were gathering inside the stone I carried. I didn't look at it, yet I never looked too soon. I like to let the moment finish speaking before the world pulls me somewhere else. So I stayed there a little longer, breathing slowly, watching the last threads of firelight dance against the adobe walls, letting the night wrap itself gently around the people who lived it every day, and around me, the visitor who drifted through just for a dream's length of time. The weaving woman gave me a nod. Small, quiet, but unmistakably kind. I nodded back, and as the glow in my palm grew just a little brighter, I let the stillness of the village settle into my chest like the final stripe in a long, calm blanket. Time to drift onward, but not before appreciating how beautifully ordinary this night had been. Thank you for sharing it with me. And if you ever want another sleepy time traveler story, well, I'll be right here, waiting to wander into the next quiet moment with you. Thanks for listening. Come back anytime you need a little calm.